If I could have our folks sit down and fill up the seats. I want to welcome you all to our morning plenary session. I think we had a fairly great first day. What do you think? We had a stellar lineup of speakers, including capping off the day with a visit to the White House, and that was something special. I saw your iPhones and Blackberries taking pictures, and I don't care who you are, where you live, or how many times you've been to the White House, but when you're in that room and you have the President of the United States, it's a little special. So it was great that they hosted us in the way that they did so graciously. But today we have another great day ahead of us. We'll be joined by Tom Friedman of the New York Times. We'll also have some important discussions on the 2012 campaign. We'll have exports and ports, an issue critical when you look at 8 out of the 10 new markets for all of us will be markets abroad. Youth violence is an issue that I know Mayor Nutter will be leading, and that momentum will carry us into the final day when we'll discuss education issues and also hear from two great friends of mine, two great mayors, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel and New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Now, for the last 11 years, DuPont has been a platinum partner with a conference of mayors called Cities United for Science Progress, or CUSP. The partnership promotes both lead safety and science in schools. I'd like to introduce a good friend of the conference, DuPont Public Affairs Manager Mary Kate Campbell, to give us an update on what CUSP will be focusing on this year.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Mayor Villaraigosa. Thanks for having me here to update the mayors on our partnership with the USCM. And good morning to my hometown mayor, Baker, if he is here in the audience this morning. So as Mayor Villaraigosa said, we're here to celebrate our 11th year of partnership with the USCM, where we've been bringing science, education, and resources to mayors to help make cities safer, smarter, and healthier. And I'm happy to report that our partnership remains strong. Together, we've done some great work to address the issue of elevated blood lead levels in children. Since the inception of our partnership, DuPont has put more than $5 million into your neighborhoods through the Lead Safe for Kids' Sake grant program. And the reduction of elevated blood lead levels across the nation has been one of our nation's biggest public health success stories. Blood lead levels throughout the country are now lower than they have been in recent history. Another issue we have worked on together is science education. Just 2 days ago, DuPont Chair and CEO Ellen Kuhlman told U.S. President Barack Obama and fellow members of the President's Jobs and Competitiveness Council that closing the skills gap is critical to American competitiveness, and that a concerted national effort to close the widening gap between the skills needed in the U.S. workplace and the skills being produced by its education and worker training systems is needed. Along with Facebook CEO Sheryl Sandberg, Ms. Kuhlman co-authored the education section of the final Jobs Council report. She said that companies are struggling to fill available jobs with skilled workers even while Americans remain unemployed. We can and we must ensure that we provide our citizens with the education and the skills to compete in the global economy and ensure that U.S. companies have a skilled workforce. Their report included recommendations spanning from preschool through universities and community college, and call on the private sector and government at all levels, along with the public, to work together to address this critical need. With that sobering testimony in mind, our focus this year is on our city's elementary school children. Many of you are familiar with our Science in the School Day program, where we introduce elementary school children to science and engineering in a fun way, with some of DuPont's most promising engineers. Through this program, we target 4th and 5th grade students in the public, charter, and parochial schools all over the country. And the goal is to get our kids interested in science and engineering at an early age so that we can ultimately keep them competitive with the world. Mayor Villaraigosa himself has said we must not lose sight of this basic fact, that we will not sustain the recovery without an educated workforce. If our students can't parse a paragraph, if they can't do math equations, if they don't understand science formulas, they will not succeed in today's highly competitive, increasingly global knowledge-based economy. So through the Science in the School Day program, we pair the mayor with our field engineers. These are some of DuPont's youngest, most promising young professionals to reach out to our nation's youth. And it's no accident that we choose our field engineers for this task. The kids relate to them. They are a diverse group. They are still cool. And like the students that they're working with, these engineers may have dreamed of being singers, professional athletes, or actors, but along the way, someone introduced them to science in a way that captured their imagination. And engineering is a pretty good backup in the event that they don't end up winning American Idol or becoming a professional baseball player. Careers in the sciences are in demand, and they pay well. Like I tell my own kids, dream as big as you want, and I'm right there with you. But have a backup plan and get busy on the math homework. We try to make it as easy as possible for cities to participate in this program. Once the mayor selects the schools, and we most recently worked with Mayor Francis Slay on one of the largest events that we have had in our history, where we had more than 48 different elementary schools, public and private, in his own city. Once the mayor selects the schools, we work directly with the principals and the teachers. We buy the materials, set up the event, and we are with you every step of the way to make sure that all goes smoothly. All we need from the mayor is the date and the selection of the schools. So please don't hesitate to contact us, and we will arrange a time to bring this program to your city. If we can light a few sparks every time we do one of these events, that is no small achievement. Thanks for allowing me the time to update you, Mayor. We look forward to working with you throughout this year. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Kate. Before we move to our panel, let me recognize a man that needs no introduction in the Conference of Mayors. He's our distinguished past president, Joe Riley, the mayor of Charleston, South Carolina. 10-time re-elected mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, I may add.
Thank you, Mayor Villaraigosa, my dear colleagues. On the 16th of this past December, Pat Murphy died. I come here this morning to talk about him just for a few minutes because his spirit is in all of your neighborhoods and in every police department in our country. For Pat Murphy was the father of community policing, the father of modern, positive police procedures and techniques, which are contributing at this very moment to the increased safety of our neighborhoods and our cities throughout America. Pat Murphy's parents immigrated from Ireland. His daddy was a police officer for the city of New York, as were two of his older brothers. He naturally gravitated to that public service after World War II. And Pat Murphy understood intuitively, as things were changing in America, that, which would have been unnatural for him anyway, but the head bashing, the antagonistic, and sometimes back then, corrupt practices of law enforcement were wrong, but also weren't going to make America and their communities safer when things were changing. Fear and intimidation no longer would work as societal changes were happening. There had to be mutual bonds of admiration and respect. One wonderful story of Pat Murphy when he was a young police officer in New York City working as an Irish man in an Italian neighborhood and trying to get information about a burglar, trying to help solve a problem, that he would knock on the apartment doors to ask. Usually the person who would be there would be the woman of the house if she had any information, and to put her at ease, he would discuss cooking. And his son said that they had 100 different recipes for spaghetti in their household that Pat Murphy had accumulated in walking the neighborhoods of New York. He was recruited from New York and became the police chief in Syracuse, and then Detroit, and then Washington. And John Lindsay sought him to come and cleanse the police department of New York City of its corruption and of its old tactics that clearly were wrong and weren't working. It was interesting when Pat was in Syracuse, he told me this story. It was just Pat that police chiefs know that there's some things, new police, when he comes to town, that you've got to change. And then there's just some things you don't mess with. And in Syracuse, and I assume it's still there, there was one neighborhood that was an Irish neighborhood, and they had their street lights, the bulbs were reversed, and the green was on top, and then the yellow and the red, that the Irish community was not going to have red above green, and Pat Murphy knew not to mess with that. When he was a commissioner in Washington, he was commissioner in Washington in the city during the riots after the assassination of Dr. King, a tragic time in our city's history, and it created cauldrons in some cities of our country, tragically. Pat Murphy would not let his police officers in Washington, D.C. pull out their firearms. And they were told to the looters and people in distress, rather, that they were requested to head home. The violence great violence that scarred so many cities escaped our nation's capital. The eyes of the world were on us because of the wise and courageous leadership of this great man. After leaving New York City, retiring as police chief, he joined the Police Foundation, and then he helped found the Police Executive Research Foundation, which works closely with the Conference of Mayors, as you know, because he felt that policing needed the research and education component, which we all now so clearly understand 20 years ago was a bit of a new idea. And then he joined the Conference of Mayors and was a phenomenal resource for all of us. He was the go-to person if you were looking for a new police chief, or if you had a problem, something that worried you, or a challenge of law enforcement, which we know is our first responsibility in our cities. We had Pat Murphy at our side. He was a very humble man, happy, fun, friendly, gentle, and so wise. And for me personally, getting to know Pat, I would often, and Betty, his wife, who survives him, would be at the meetings, and they loved it. They loved being with mayors. They loved all that's going on. They wouldn't miss a one. They'd go to annual meetings and just to sit down and have a drink with them and talk about the serious matters of making our city safer, or talking about family, or something fun was a treasure for me, and something that I will keep with me all of my life. He was a cop's cop, a police chief's police chief. He was a mayor's friend, and he was such a fine human being. Pat Betty Murphy Pat was one of 7 children. He and Betty, busy police chief and all of everything, they have 7 children, 21 grandchildren, and 17 great-grandchildren. The happy thought about that is that the genes and the goodness of Pat Murphy is extending for generations to come. We have with us today his son, Gerard Jerry Murphy, who works is a part of the team at the Police Executive Research Forum. So I'd just like to ask Jerry to stand and be recognized as we think of his dad and honor his service.
Thank you for that beautiful tribute to Pat Murphy. And this morning I wanted us to have a thoughtful discussion about the presidential and congressional elections. I think our collective concern is the silence that's deafening about the state of America's cities. You know, it's interesting, every year when we present the Metro Economies report, it seems that members of Congress are, living on some other planet. They don't realize that 90% of the GDP is generated in our cities, that 85% of the jobs that are created this year will be created in our cities. As some of you have heard me, if we just talked about 10 cities, the 10 top cities in America, we're talking about an economy the size of France. If you talked about we're talking about an economy that would be the 3rd largest economy in the world. It would be a $5 trillion economy, much double the size of France. It'd be, if you talked about just the 3 largest metropolitan areas, you're talking about an economy the size of France. You'd never know that talking to the Congress. So getting the candidates to focus on domestic and metro priorities is important. Getting them to think about and talk about and most importantly do something about infrastructure investment, the ongoing housing crisis, job creation. These are the issues that we're here on. So yesterday we had an opportunity to meet with President Obama at the White House to discuss some of these priorities. We invited the major Republican candidates to be with us, but of course they're a little busy out in the campaign trail. I think they're in South Carolina, as a matter of fact. And so to help us understand where this election is going, we've invited some of the nation's top political experts to frame the current debate. And I'm very pleased that today we have with us Steve Schmidt, who was senior campaign strategist and advisor to the presidential campaign of John McCain in 2008, a friend of mine and someone who's also advised my very close friend, the governor I worked with, Governor Schwarzenegger. And I'm also extremely pleased that we have with us Anita Dunn, who served as senior communications strategist for President Obama in both the campaign and the White House. And we're most fortunate to have as our moderator today, Mike Allen, the chief White House correspondent for Politico. And Mike came to Politico from Time magazine, where he was their White House correspondent. Prior to that, he spent 6 years at the Washington Post, where he covered President Bush's first term and Capitol Hill campaign finance, the Bush, Gore, and Bradley campaigns of 2000. So when it comes to U.S. politics, these people have been in the thick of things for a long time, and they've got the scars to prove it. As national political and media experts, I know they'll lead us in a very meaningful discussion. And so, Mike, it's yours.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. President, thank you very much for having us. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for the honor of talking to you. We're going to plunge right into a great conversation here. It's a great honor to talk to all of you. I've enjoyed visiting with some of you because here in Washington, we can talk all we want, but you and your colleagues have to actually do it. And so I'm looking forward to connecting with you. The last time I saw the mayor, he was in spandex. And you'll be happy to know that it was not on Meet the Press. But he was, we were both in Aspen, and the mayor, we were doing a hike with Lance Armstrong. They had a sort of a bunny slope hike where I dropped off. The mayor, you went all the way to the peak, right? And did you get to ride a gondola back, though? No. Okay, so he did it up and back. So back. Okay. Okay. Very exciting time to be in Washington, and we're going to start with a little breaking news. Most of you have probably seen on your device that just in the last few minutes, Texas Governor Rick Perry has said he's going to pull out of the presidential race today, and he's going to endorse Newt Gingrich. So we're going to plunge right into that. Anita Dunn, there's a debate at 8 o'clock tonight. As the mayor would say, 5 o'clock real time tonight on CNN. We're now down to 4, right? How does Rick Perry's sudden exit affect the chessboard going into Saturday's South Carolina primary?
Well, I tend to leave the prognosticating about Republican primaries to the people who know that party, which would be Steve. But I will say, just think about tonight's debate for a second. You have a 2-hour debate, and when it was scheduled, you had 6 or 7 candidates. Now you have 4 candidates, and an interesting dynamic in that Santorum and Gingrich are fighting with each other to be the Romney alternative, and yet they both also have to take Romney on directly. You have Romney coming off what is arguably his weakest debate performance of the entire election cycle, and he has become a very, very good debater, I think much better than he was in 2008. And then you have Ron Paul, who charts his own course at all of these debates, but who doesn't.
That was nice.
but frankly tends to do well in these debates in terms of his supporters because he's very clear, he's very straightforward, and he doesn't sound like a typical politician. So I actually want to kick this to Steve to get his analysis.
Well, I think for much of the year, this has become the greatest reality show on television. And if you look at the cast of characters that have run for president, some of them have fallen away. It's been a really interesting process to watch. I think you have a number of balls in the air right now. It may well be the case by the end of the day that we find out that Rick Santorum, in fact, won the Iowa caucuses. At either rate, who the winner was is maybe impossible to know. But if the news cycle today becomes that Rick Santorum pulled ahead, I think that's a further loss of momentum and altitude for Mitt Romney, who I think is having one of the toughest weeks he's had over the course of the primary election with the tax story, which I think was not handled particularly well by Governor Romney and by Gingrich resurgence. He was down, he was on his back, he appears to be up. There's going to be a very controversial interview that takes place with a Gingrich ex-wife this evening on ABC, and who knows what's gonna come out of that. But I think we're going to see the realization of hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and so it will be an interesting dynamic. It'll be an interesting dynamic over the next 24 hours. I do think that if you look ahead and if you look at conventional wisdom is that Mitt Romney will be the Republican nominee for president. I think that anyone you talk to in the political or journalistic community in Washington who's been around campaigns believes that. I believe that whether Anita will say it or not and may not be able to. I think the White House is preparing to run against Mitt Romney. I think that Newt Gingrich is utterly implausible as a potentially victorious candidate in a general election sense. He's been incredibly erratic over the course of the campaign, One moment he's not going to attack his opponents, the next moment they're liars and they're looters. One moment he's the conservative candidate in the race, the next his rhetoric is identical to people, who could be carrying signs in the Occupy Wall Street movement. So it will be interesting to see what the outcome of South Carolina is, because Ron Paul will stay in this race until the last primary is over. I think he'll pull somewhere between 18 to 25% of the vote.
Wait, Steve, that means June, right? You're saying that
all the way through. All the way through. Because he's not running for president, he's running to advance an idea and to change the trajectory and the discussion of American politics, really to mainstream the issues that he cares about. And, in fact, he's doing an effective job about that. And I think he's initiated what's going to become a big debate, for example, on national security issues in the Republican Party. But Saturday will be an interesting race in South Carolina. I think if Mitt Romney wins in South Carolina, the nomination fight will be effectively over.
Well, wait, how much does he have to win by?
I just think he has to win. I think that expectations were so low for Mitt Romney in South Carolina going in that it was never a must-win state. It's always been the determinative state in Republican primary politics going back to 1980. But if he wins, I think the race will begin to shut down. Whether Santorum gets out of the race or Gingrich gets out of the race or not, I suspect they won't. But he'll be well on his way to be the nominee. If he's not, I think he's still likely to be the nominee. But Florida is going to be a painful week, and then you'll have this long break before the Super Tuesday states, and everyone will stay in the race.
Now, Anita Dunn, in addition to being a managing partner of SKD Knickerbocker, one of the fastest-growing firms in Washington, is an advisor to President Obama. Steve Schmidt says we were looking at a Obama-Romney race. How does that look to you?
Well, I think the president's campaign has always anticipated a tough race and a close race regardless of who the Republican nominee was. And in reality, most of the Republican candidates who are running have ended up taking relatively similar positions on almost all of the major issues, whether they are social issues. And now some of them came to those issues, shall we say, later in their careers than others. But they've all kind of ended up at the same place, whether they're social or fiscal issues, whether they're issues around federal spending or whether they're issues around tax, that they all fundamentally have aligned pretty much with the Republican Congress. So we've always anticipated from an issue point of view that we would be running against a nominee who was going to be carrying the banner, like it or not, of the very unpopular policies that this Republican Congress has seen fit to try to adopt over the last 15 months. So, and as much as they would like to try to escape that, they will have that. Now, in terms of moving forward, I think that one of the things that I have found interesting is that in 2008, our prolonged primary process actually ended up, I think, making President Obama, then candidate Obama, a much stronger candidate. I think that the fight against now Secretary Clinton, against a really top candidate, ended up making him a much better candidate than he would have been if the process had been wrapped up early. And I've watched the Republican process. I am not at all convinced that this process has made whoever the eventual nominee is a stronger candidate. I think that the kinds of attacks that you're seeing right now are ones that, frankly, we would have anticipated as general election attacks, whether they're questions about, what kind of value you bring to the economy, if you are primarily concerned, if you've spent your entire life at an investment firm, or whether they're questions around tax equity and whether or not, investment income should be taxed the same way that people who work hard for a living and punch that clock should be taxed. And I think that this is not a primary process that has been helpful to the eventual nominee. Now, from the president's point of view, he's always known he was going to have a tough race where he had to defend his record and also had to put out a vision of where this country can go moving forward. And I think that process is beginning. And I think what you've seen since August is a president who is very clearly stating not just the differences in policy, but also a very different kind of vision of what America can be.
Steve, Anita's pointing out that during the primary process, Governor Romney has been pulled to the right on a number of issues, banged up on a few issues. And when you look at primaries, is it a case of 'twas ever thus, or will this make it harder for Mitt Romney to go up against President Obama?
I agree with Anita that there is a difference between the 2008 Democratic Party primary process and the Republican process in 2012. And it was basically this, that both Barack Obama, Senator Obama, and Senator Clinton were both prepared and qualified to be President of the United States. And whomever was going to be the winner of that contest, there was no question that they were fit from a character perspective, from an intellectual perspective, to take the oath of office. And that's not the case with all of the Republican candidates, though it is the case with Governor Romney. So I think that when you are running against people in a primary process who are not plausible commander-in-chiefs, it becomes a diminishing experience as opposed to an elevating experience over the course of the debate. And I just think that that's a big piece. And I'd also say as much of the focus has been on the Republican primary contest, the big political story, I think, over the last 6 months since the low point is though it is glacial, though it is slow, you have seen a steady improvement of the president's approval numbers from a very, very dangerous place in the context of trying to get reelected to a place where there's a vulnerability still, but where those numbers are improving into the range where, for example, we were in the 2004 Bush campaign. And the other thing, when you talk about the context of a close election, I think it's important, to bear in mind that in 2008, which, was the worst Republican environment that a Republican candidate has ever had a run in a race that we were outspent by $250 million, President got 53% of the vote, and John McCain, in the aftermath of a global economic collapse, got 47% of the vote. And I think that all of these messages that you hear, when you hear the Republican message, 47% of the American population responds to it. Mm-hmm. When you hear the president's message, 47% of the population responds to it. And there's about 6% of the population that's going to decide the outcome of the election. And it'll be interesting to see how that group evolves over the course of the next year.
I mean, the reality is that we've had extraordinarily close elections. Even as Steve points out, 2008 was not by any means a landslide, although people remember it that way. It was actually a very close election.
Yeah, but President Obama got 52.9%, right?
Yeah, but 2000, 2004, 1996, where Bill Clinton didn't get 50% of the vote. People don't remember that, but he didn't get 50% of the vote. Got 49.9, I think, or 49.7, but he didn't even get 50% of the vote. This is a very closely divided nation and continues to be and has been for several elections now. And you're going to see a very close election unless by some extraordinary set of circumstances that I personally can't imagine, the Republican Party nominates somebody who is deemed unelectable by the electorate. So.
Now, Steve Schmidt is Vice Chairman of Public Affairs of Edelman, which is a firm that, in addition to being global, is also independent. Steve, you pointed out that there has been a glacial but unmistakable increase in the president's approval ratings. Something else that matches that description is the economy. The economy is unquestionably getting slightly better. As you all know better than anyone, it's tough to feel, but the statistics are pointing that way. Does that remove a lot of the argument for Mitt Romney?
So when we sit up here and we talk about what's going to happen in elections, we often talk about them through the prism of events that have already occurred. And I think this election is fundamentally going to be shaped by events that have yet to occur. And so, for example, the Euro crisis will have a dramatic impact on whatever nascent recovery the American economy is underway. And there's also the question of how the American people feel. And if you look at the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, you have 74% of people think that the country is on the wrong track, and it's the 93rd consecutive month where people think that the country is on the wrong track.
That's a lot of Bush months were included in that.
Absolutely. Yes. And Edelman does a global survey every year. It's the largest of its kind in the world. It's called the Trust Barometer. And it's 30,000 people surveyed in 30 countries all around the world. And the trend is a total collapse of trust in government, not just in the United States. And I don't mean this as a partisan statement, because it's not. When I say collapse in trust of government, it applies to both parties. But you see that occurring globally. So unemployment will remain high. People are pessimistic. People don't trust the government. People think the country's heading in the wrong direction. And I think the fundamental challenge for the president in that environment, and all presidents who are incumbents have about a 66% chance just on the odds of getting reelected. His challenge is to communicate that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And I think his reelection is difficult absent the ability to communicate that, because I think that that's what the American people are, fundamentally looking for. Who is going to make this better? Because the one thing in a closely divided nation where Republicans and Democrats don't agree on a lot is that everybody agrees, universally in the country, that it's not going in the right direction and that these are bad times. And I think when you look at the instability in the congressional elections, we're in a cycle that if there is a 20-seat switch, which is entirely possible in the House, it would be the first time since the 48, 50, 52, 1954 cycle where you've had switches that big. And I think that's all being fueled, and all of this instability in American politics is being fueled by that very high wrong track number and that deep sense of pessimism in the country. And I think that will frame the election.
All right, Anita Dunn, Steve Schmidt talks about the president's communications challenges. Among the many hats you've worn in Washington is White House Communications Director. President Obama is one of the greatest political communicators of our lifetime, maybe the best since Ronald Reagan. Why does he have that challenge? Why has he lost that connection with the American people?
Well, I think that it is always a challenge when you're in the White House to keep that connection with the American people, because you have so many hurdles. And both Steve and I have been on that side of the wall. And as people in government yourself, you know that the best laid plans can be waylaid pretty easily by events outside of your control. Having said that, I think that what you've seen, as Steve suggests, is not only the improvement, the beginning of the improvement of the economy in a way that people actually see and feel. But you've also seen the president since August going out and communicating very directly with the American people about what his priorities are, where he wants to take this country, where we've been, but more importantly, where we're going and how we have to get there and how he will lead us there. And the contrast in message since August between the president and between the Republican candidates has been striking, because the Republican candidates as a group tend to have an extraordinarily pessimistic message that has to do with going back. It has to do with getting rid of this, getting rid of that, but it's not at all forward-looking in terms of where we go and how we get there. It is a lot of going back to this, going back, getting rid of this, getting rid of that kind of thing. Whereas the president has laid out, I think, has begun to lay out a very, very tangible set of values and visions for the American people in terms of a middle class that works, in terms of an economy where hard work is rewarded, where people take responsibility, where businesses and individuals are held accountable. Fundamental values that made this country great to begin with. And I think that is going to be a real contrast. Next week, he delivers the State of the Union. The State of the Union for any president is always the best opportunity to kind of lay out what that vision will be for the year. But I think that that as you progress, as challengers, the Republicans have to make the case against the president and make the case why they are the best to replace them. But that one of the great challenges they have is actually getting to an optimistic message, given that their base is such an angry base and appears to respond best to the candidates who deliver the most red meat at any given time in terms of contrast with the president. And that's a huge challenge. One of the great things that Obama had in 2008 was the ability to criticize the status quo while still maintaining the optimistic message. And I don't think any of the Republican candidates have shown they can strike that balance yet.
In just a few minutes, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. We're going to have some microphones for you, so get your questions ready. But first, Steve Schmidt made a very fascinating point that the Edelman Trust Barometer, where they do global opinion sampling, found a collapse in support for government. This isn't just a U.S. issue, and it's not a partisan issue. Both President Obama, President Bush seem uniquely equipped to work across the aisles. Steve Schmidt, why is Washington frozen, and what would change that? What will change that?
I think it's frozen fundamentally because of a continuing cycle of political violence where the intentions of the other political party in terms of trying to do right by the country are constantly called into question.
Well, and you're one of the chief callers.
Like a partisan game. When I ran, when I was in the business of running campaigns, I've done my fair share of it.
As a candidate,
Ronald Reagan talked about the fact that in this country, we don't have political enemies, we have political opponents. And if you look back at a generation of Americans, maybe it was because they fought in a real war together against a real existential threat. And men like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, while fierce partisan opponents, could never look at each other through the prism of enemy. And if you talk to people who have been in Washington for a long time, the social mixing that used to occur between the wives of Democrat and Republican members of Congress, or increasingly as we have more women members of the House and Senate, the husbands, it just doesn't exist anymore. There's very little contact, there's very little mingling, and everybody is geared up to provide content for the cable news, entertainment, industrial complex, which does not reward the reasonable person who goes out and says this is a solution to the problem. And I not to drone on, Mike, but there was a fascinating Charlie Rose special where he had the mayors, and I think Mayor Villaraigosa was on it, with the 10 biggest mayors in the country. There were Republicans on it, there were Democrats on it, and it was a discussion based in pragmatism and reality with people who actually have to make decisions and run stuff. And I remember watching it, and I found it just so fundamentally detached, right, from what goes on in Washington. And it's an unhealthy process and system.
When I worked at the DSCC, the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, and as I was listening to Mayor Riley, I was remembering we tried to recruit him to run for the Senate, and he always wisely refused to even have that conversation. But we used to say, when we were trying to recruit mayors and governors to run for the United States Senate, we would say, don't let them talk to former mayors or former governors who actually got to the Senate, because they're all miserable. Okay, and don't let them do that. But Steve is absolutely right. Governors and mayors who are accountable for results, who actually have to do things, have a very, very different outlook on politics than what happens here in Washington, where fundamentally, if an issue is debated and argued about, and then nothing happens on it, people move on. It's like, okay, well, that's not a problem any longer because we're not talking about it any longer. But you can't do that in a city, right? If you've got a problem, you've got to do something about it. This is one of the reasons why, going to Steve's Trust Barometer, but if you look at any kind of polling data, the closer you get to actually delivering services and being accountable to people, the better people feel about their government.
Okay, excuse me, what can change that? What can change the conditions that Steve has diagnosed?
Well, I actually believe that voters, at the end of the day, have to be the first line of changing this, for the very simple reason that right now voters in both parties have been rewarding the most polarizing kind of behavior in their primary processes. And I think Steve would agree. I think it started with our party back in the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party days, and I'm not saying that is a terrible thing, but the reality is that between redistricting and between the primary processes, not just for the presidency, but also for the legislative offices in Congress in particular, that the activist wings of both parties, thanks in no small part to the fact that that campaign finance rules have changed, and that the internet has given people a portal to democracy, which is a wonderful thing, but also means that that again, those people who make the most noise can often get the most support. So the reality is that voters who say they are sick and tired of the partisan gridlock, voters who say that they want solutions, they want people here who will work across the aisle, voters actually have to step up and take control of this democracy again. I am a huge believer that at the end of the day, when voters say they've had enough of this behavior, then people are going to change their behavior. But I don't actually see politicians deciding absent that, because right now, centrist behavior gets penalized and not rewarded at the voting booth.
Okay, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. If you have a question, just stand up. We'll get you a microphone pronto. If you don't mind just saying who you are and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi.
Identify yourself.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lee Fong from the Republic Report. The 2012 election is shaping up to be just as much about the undue influence of lobbyists, just as much about the economy. You see this from the rhetoric of Occupy Wall Street to the attack ads from Romney against Gingrich. So my question is for Anita Dunn. You have a lot of access to the president, from advising his campaign to regular visits to the White House. Do you think it's a little bit disingenuous that you're simultaneously being paid by a lot of corporations to lobby against his reforms, specifically on childhood obesity and predatory for-profit colleges?
Okay, go.
Okay, well, I'd like to start by saying that I'm not a lobbyist. I never have been a registered lobbyist, and I do public relations. And the reality...
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is, and I should also say to my friend over here, that my cooling off period from the White House, because this president has instituted some of the strongest ethical reforms of any president ever, means that I actually don't talk to anybody in this administration about any issue where I'm doing public relations. For 2 years after I left the White House, because as White House communications director, I was actually involved in so many issues that it's not possible to say, oh, I'm going to wall off this area. So I actually don't talk to anybody in the White House. And I do work with people, and I do work with nonprofits, and I work with some corporations, because the fact of the matter is we're in a democracy, and there's a dialogue, and people have a right to be heard. And the fact of the matter is that most of the time when I work with people, they have a story to be told, and we tell it. Now, this president has done things that allow my friend over here to say, well, I'm a regular visitor to the White House. Why? Because part of the move of this White House towards transparency is to make sure that anybody can go on anytime and see who's visiting the White House. It sounds like a small thing, but it isn't, because it means that there's a greater degree of transparency and accountability. This White House, by and large, has shut down the revolving door because people who leave the White House cannot lobby this administration on issues that they worked on while they were inside the administration. This White House and this campaign don't take money from registered lobbyists. Now, these are not rules that Congress applies to itself. As we move forward in our political process, I think one thing you will see is that voters will continue to demand greater transparency from everybody. And if you look right now at Governor Romney's kind of flailing around on whether he's going to release his tax returns, the reality is that politicians aren't going to have a choice about transparency much longer in this country, because voters expect it of them.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just say for future questions, I'd like to start with the mayors. That's
all right. We've got the lights on now. Over, yes, sir, right there. Yes, and we'll get you a microphone, but just go ahead and start.
Good morning.
I'll repeat the question, but yes, please identify.
Who are you?
Who's the person?
There you go.
Timothy Herbst, Mayor, Trumbull, Connecticut.
Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to thank both of you for coming this morning. I really have enjoyed your chat. I have a very simple question. Last two presidents have really, I think, put an emphasis on who they have selected as a vice president, looking for certain things in their running mates. If you were advising Mitt Romney what would you be advising him as to look for in a running mate, somebody running with him as vice president?
It's a great question, Steve Schmidt.
My wife has said that I should never give an answer to a question about who to pick for vice president ever.
We won't tell her.
Look, I think first and foremost, on the issue of who to pick for vice president, it's an important question, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the 2008 campaign, but also from the 2004 campaign, because I think the selection process is fundamentally broken in a number of different ways, and both parties have resulted in nominating people who were manifestly unprepared and unqualified to be president of the United States. John Edwards on the Democratic side, and of course, on the Republican side in 2008. There's a lack of, having gone through this process on our part, there was a lack of, stepping back, it was, in 2008, it's a story of assumptions. That this person is a governor, therefore this person has a knowledge base and an issues base that de minimisly would make them prepared to do this, and that turned out not to be the case. It's also a story about outcomes that don't go the way you want them. No one had the intention of putting forward someone who was manifestly unprepared to be president of the United States. But the focus is on trying to win the election. The focus is on trying to get ahead. It's a story of ambition. It's a story of wanting to win. And this is a process that requires a great deal of circumspection. And I think on the part of the media, on the part of the press, it should be framed for what it is. This is the first presidential decision that a candidate makes, and that the candidate makes really by themselves, where they have to take the measure of the person that they're going to put into the position of being the next in line. And if you look at the history of the country, a lot of vice presidents have had to come forward to take the 35-word oath and assume the duties of commander-in-chief. And I think that, obviously for my part over the last couple of years, it's an issue that I've thought about a great deal, because when you run a presidential campaign or you're involved in the decision-making of a presidential campaign, you never have the aspiration to have a result where someone was forwarded into this, who was not prepared.
All right, Anita Dunn, let's be clinical about this. If you were advising Governor Romney, would you advise him to pick as his vice president Senator Marco Rubio of Florida or Senator Rob Portman of Ohio?
Well, if I were in that room with him, I would say, remember, the two most important things are, one, that you believe this person is prepared to be the president of the United States. If, God forbid, something happens, that you have that confidence and that you can go out. As Steve says, it's your first presidential decision. Can you go out, look the American people in the eye and say, this is the person? And the second is, do you have a personal comfort level? And do you trust this person? Because the role of the vice president has evolved to an enormous degree since, I believe it was John Nance Garner who said it wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit, right? I mean, it's actually become an operational role and a very engaged role, and that's a good thing. But that means that the president has to have a certain degree of trust. So I think those two things. One, can you say that this person is prepared to be president? So then, if you look at the two names that you said, Rob Portman, I think, is someone who you can certainly present to the American people as someone who has served in government, who has an understanding of the fiscal issues, who, clearly has been through enough vetting processes that, to play off what Steve said, that he's got the base of knowledge about national issues. With Senator Rubio, who I don't know his record as well, you would probably want to do some significant vetting And I think that that is something that can't be underestimated, because you don't want to be surprised once you announce that person to the American people. But I think that at the end of the day, fortunately, it's not my decision. It's going to be the Republican nominee's decision. And given the fact that if the Republican nominee is Mitt Romney, the guess is that he probably does want to pick someone who offers him regional diversity and who offers something to fill out his governing resume, something that he doesn't have in his governing profile. I would also add, though, that the idea that a vice presidential candidate brings their state or brings anything to the ticket, I regard as, by and large, just not true. Maybe occasionally they can help you in an individual state, but at the end of the day, you pick the person that you think can be president.
Vice President Biden.
And I think clinically, Mike, too, it's that the only criteria here that should matter is this person prepared to take the oath of office to be president of the United States? And there's a list of people who meet that qualification in both parties, and then there are other people that don't. And I think all of the political calculations have to be subordinate to that. And I think it's one of the chief lessons of 2008.
Okay, I think we have a question in this zip code. Yes, sir, down front.
Hi, and thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Bill Globa, Mayor of the City of Davenport. The question I have is sort of this. In 2008, President Obama won by approximately 9 million votes nationwide, one of the biggest margins since probably Lyndon Johnson. He won with young people, students, Afro-Americans, poor Hispanics. In 2010, we got the worst shellacking we've had since the Civil War or something. Lost 63 House seats, 63 congressmen. I remember in 2008, 39 people I got out of the vote in a homeless shelter, never voted before. Went to the same shelter in 2010, no one voted. What can you tell me to reassure me a little bit that things are going to be different, that people are, in fact, in these demographics going to turn out? When I see thousands of people protesting, young people, Occupy movement, I see the highest poverty we've had up among our base. And so what are the polls showing? How is the campaign going to get to these people? I don't think Romney necessarily can, but what are we doing? What do you see? What are the positive signs you see in these demographics that didn't vote in 2010? Thank you.
Anita Dunn, to what degree can you reassure the mayor?
In 2010, the election, as midterms are, was a referendum. It was not a choice, and it wasn't framed as a choice. Presidential elections have a very different dynamic than midterm elections, and I think that this presidential election will present a very clear choice to people. And so that's the first thing I would say, is that rather than having the people turn out who tend to be angriest at the administration, that there will be more. You always get a larger turnout in presidential election years anyway, but that there will be a very clear choice, and that the president will frame the choice, I think, in a way that will motivate people to come out, because it really is a significant difference. And you as mayors understand what the stakes are here, because you've been living with this, the idea that somehow the federal government can just reduce all of the discretionary spending in the federal budget and we'll all live happily ever after. And you know that's not true. And you know that there are significant needs in this country, significant investments that need to be made in education, in transportation, in your infrastructure, in sewer systems, in those things that the federal government needs to do in order to build us for a stronger future. And that is going to be a huge thing, especially for young voters, okay? Because young voters are the people who really have the great stake in what happens next. And I think that the different visions, a vision of an America where hard work is rewarded, where we have responsibility and accountability for government, for business, and for individuals, where we don't have a you're on your own sort of attitude, but where people and government make investments, work together, have public-private partnerships, whether it's an infrastructure bank, whether it's the kind of education programs that all of you are doing in your cities in public-private partnerships, whatever it is, where people are working together to move this nation forward together. And that is the president's vision, and that is something that's going to be incredibly important and different from a Republican vision that we've seen through this Republican Congress, which is you're on your own, tough luck, let's cut all these critical programs that help disproportionately seniors and low-income people so that we can keep taxes low for the people who do the best in this country. And that is going to be, as Steve said right at the beginning, there's going to be a major debate in 2012. I think it is a healthy debate for this country to have. But I also think that debate will motivate people to come out and vote in a way that they weren't motivated in 2010, when it wasn't seen as a choice of two very different directions. So that's what I would say.
Steve Schmidt.
Yeah.
Well, I obviously on the frame of the issues, I profoundly disagree. The tax code, I think, is more progressive than it has ever been. The most compassionate policy government can have, I believe, is a pro-growth economic policy. I think that the federal debt is an enormous crisis for this country at $15 trillion with no end in sight, and I think that we will have an election that's based on a choice, but Anita is entirely right. In a midterm election, it's a referendum, and it's often a referendum on incumbent presidents, and you've only had two occasions, 2002 and 1934, where there were first-term presidents had pickups in seats in that first midterm election. Every other president has lost seats, and as we talked about earlier, I think there's a number of other factors that are driving instability, but an election for president is a choice. This will not be an election, in terms of the type of job that, the president is doing. It's a choice of who's going to do a better job, the Republican nominee or the president. For example, there is an ABC Washington Post poll out that shows that 57%, of voters disapprove of the way the president is handling the economy. Now, as a Republican, I look at that through two prisms. The first way I look at it is, well, that means that there is a lot of room to criticize the president on the economy. But also, because I think that the president's floor in this election is 47%, is that a very significant percentage of the people who object to his handling of the economy are in fact going to vote for him structurally in the election. So it's going to be a very close election. I think that there are some elections where there are pale differences between the parties and that the choice isn't painted in bold, bright, colors. And I think this election is going to be one where there are clear lines, clear choices, and bold, bright colors. And I think it's going to be a healthy debate because there is a fundamentally different vision offered by the president, and I think ultimately by the Republican nominee, about how to grow the economy and create opportunity.
In the mayor's introduction at the top, he talked about the deafening silence that he hears in the presidential race on the issues of most concern to the cities. Cities are a big driver of the economy. Anita, if I'm a mayor of Davenport or a mayor of Philadelphia, how do I better connect, or how do I connect with a Washington that doesn't seem to be listening?
For both.
I was going to say you and the rest of the country. So in terms of how you feel, I think it's critically important for mayors in particular to hold the candidates accountable, both parties, every level. Okay, both parties, every level. And you can't separate out cities from suburbs. We all know how interconnected we are as a nation. But I think that that mayors command great megaphones in their communities. And one of the things that I think Steve and I, as people who do public relations and public affairs, would tell you is that members of Congress, senators, are increasingly sensitive to what they hear in their communities. much more so than they used to be. When I'm getting a little old now, and when I started working in Washington, it was actually still possible for people to, quote, say one thing in Washington and another at home. Well, now it's not possible for people to say one thing at a town hall meeting and another thing 5 minutes later because it's already on YouTube, right? So I think that part of what mayors need to do to connect to Washington is to connect to Washington at home first and to hold people accountable and publicly accountable if you need to. Because elected officials are extraordinarily sensitive to local criticism, particularly when it's linked to very directly to how conditions are at home. I think that's one thing. And then two, I think that your collective voice is very important. There will be a Republican nominee. There is a Democratic president. There may be a third party or a libertarian candidate, but all of these people are going to come looking for votes in your areas. All of these people are going to debate, and your collective voice to put things on the national agenda is significant. And I think that picking a few critical areas, whether it is transportation and infrastructure spending, which I just happen to know some of you care about, whether it is education and education policy, which is obviously a huge debate in this country, to pick a couple of issues and make your voice heard with the candidates, holding them accountable, but also with your elected officials.
Steve?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that publicly communicating your issues as opposed to what is an antiquated approach that we can solve these with one-on-one meetings, we'll go see the congressional delegation and have a chat, doesn't work anymore. I think you need to communicate publicly. It'll be a little bit self-critical of Republicans. There was a story in the Washington Post that, over this payroll tax debate where there were a bunch of Republican members of Congress who all stood up in their conference meeting and began quoting lines out of the movie Braveheart and analogizing the payroll tax to the fight to the death, that was taking place between the British and William Wallace. And I think in the context of being a mayor and actually running something and having accountability and being responsible for services, that's just so off the wall as to almost be unimaginable. And so I think there's just a detachment between the reality that you live in and the reality that a lot of people in Washington live in. And it's important to publicly communicate your reality in a way that makes them accountable. I think that all politicians, as a species of animal, have a high instinct for self-preservation. And to the extent that you are able to put a burden onto the member of Congress that triggers that instinct by advancing your agenda and the needs of your constituents is probably an effective strategy.
And Mike, I would add one thing, which is that due to the news cycle having accelerated exponentially, so that there's much less time for the kind of in-depth policy reporting that that one would like to see, that gives you a huge advantage because you can play that role. The Conference of Mayors can play that role in terms of actually looking at the impact of the policies that the candidates are talking about. And this is something that just isn't being done as much as it used to because nobody has the time or the space or the resources to have reporters go do this. But it's critically important to you, and it's critically important to the people you represent in your cities. And so I would suggest that one way to be in that dialogue is to be the people who say this is how it will affect you in real life, not just in candidate rhetoric or a 90-second answer in a debate, but in real life. So
we're about to get the hook here, so Mayor Riley will have our last question. We'll do this as a speed round.
Well, the Tea Party movement appears to have moved the Republican Party even farther to the right. To what extent will that pose a problem, or may it prove to be a benefit to the Republican nominee?
I think the Tea Party movement is broadly misunderstood. I think the reality is there have always been conservatives in the Republican Party. There will always be liberals in the Democratic Party. I think that The fact that there are energized conservative voters accrues to the benefit of the Republican nominee ultimately. And I think that if you look at, the two movements that have gotten a great deal of media attention over the last year, the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement, I think the Tea Party movement is a movement that does good for the Republican Party, and I think that on an issue basis has appeal in the middle of the electorate. And I think one of the great unanswered questions is, what does the Occupy Wall Street movement look like in the spring? And to the degree that, you all walk by McPherson Square, I don't think that that necessarily helps the Democratic Party in the context of a general election in the fall. But I think of the two movements, and what the impact will be on the general election, the one that is likely, in my view, to be far more consequential is the Occupy Wall Street movement.
So I agree with that. The Occupy Wall Street movement is still, in many ways is still at a very early stage. But if you look at how quickly our national dialogue has changed to really address the issue nobody wanted to talk about, which is the growing inequality and income inequality in this country. And I think that that will be an issue that will be central to the economic debate in 2012. I mean, we have Republican leaders of Congress like Paul Ryan who have felt it necessary to go out and give speeches about this in a way that 6 months ago they never would have. So I think that at least for 2012, that the Occupy Wall Street movement will have a significant effect on the national dialogue, while the Tea Party movement far more effectively actually politically is organizing. So I think that's fair.
I'm going to stay around to visit with you. I'll see you on Politico.com. I'd like to thank Steve Schmidt of Edelman, Anita Dunn of SKD Knickerbocker. Thank you for great questions and the great fantastic questions.
God, let's give him a big hand. I want to thank Steve Schmidt, Anita Dunn for their insights, and Mike Allen, thank you for doing such a great job at moderating this. Very pleased to introduce our next speaker. Tom Friedman became the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times in 1995. In 2002, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for distinguished commentary, his third Pulitzer for the New York Times. He's written award-winning books. Many of you remember The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century, received the Goldman Sachs Financial Times Business Book of the Year Award. Hot, Flat, and Crowded was published in 2008, and his sixth and most recent book I recommend to every one of you. It's called That Used to Be Us: How America Fell Behind in the World We Invented and How We Can Come Back. It was co-written with Michael Mandelbaum and released last September. I had an opportunity to see Tom at a book signing and a question and answer period, and I said, you got to come to the conference. He's called for a green revolution. He's pushed for investment in our city's infrastructures, and he's promoting networked urban hubs. We know about those. As I stated yesterday with the release of our latest Metro Economies report, America's cities are the engines of America's economic future. And so at a time when our nation's mayors are working to promote a bipartisan agenda on job creation, there's no more fitting speaker for us to hear. So please join me in welcoming Tom Friedman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mayor, thank you very much. Thank all of you for having me. I was at your conference a couple years ago. It was a great treat and opportunity, and I've been looking forward to being back here this morning. I am going to take about the next 40 minutes to talk about our new book, That Used to Be Us, How America Fell Behind in the World It Invented, as the mayor said, and how we can come back. Whenever we share with people the title of our book, the first question they always have is, does it have a happy ending? And we tell everybody it does. We just don't know whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And that's really the challenge before us today. Can I get a glass of water? Now, one of the things you might be naturally wanting to ask is, how did two guys, I'm a foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times, my co-author, Professor Michael Mandelbaum, is the chaired professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins. How did two foreign policy geeks end up writing a book about domestic American politics? And the answer is very simple and I think relevant for your discussion here. We're old friends, been friends for 20 years. We happen to be neighbors in Bethesda, Maryland. We talk almost every day, and we noticed something over the last few years. We always start every day talking about the world. But we noticed lately we ended every conversation talking about America. And it was evident to us very quickly that America, its fate, future, vigor, and vitality, was actually the biggest foreign policy issue in the world. Because if we don't have a strong and sound domestic base and economy, there is no way we can play the role we need to play and the world wants us to play in the world. Michael and I are both American nationalists. We believe America makes a lot of mistakes in the world. We always have, but on a net basis, we play an enormously constructive role in the world. We are the tent pole that holds up the global system. And if that tent pole buckles or frays, your kids won't just grow up in a different America. They will grow up in a fundamentally different world. And that was really what motivated us to write this book. If there's a fear we have, the book is built around a lot of movie themes. And one of them is an old classic, really captures our concerns about the future. It's Orson Welles' 1958 film, Touch of Evil. You may remember the scene. It's a movie about murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, and corruption in a town on the Mexican-American border. Welles plays a crooked cop who tries to frame his Mexican counterpart for a murder. At one point, Welles stumbles into a brothel and finds the proprietor, Marlene Dietrich, who is also a fortune teller with cards spread out in front of her. "Read my future for me," Welles says. "You haven't got any," she replies. "Your future is all used up." Well, it was certainly that fear which is one of the things that motivated this book. We do not believe our future is all used up, but we do believe we are at a critical juncture in this country, a time of real choosing. And we need to step up to it, and we need to do it now, not in 2013, 2014, or 2020. Let me share with you, if I could, just for a few minutes. Is there a pinging going on here? Do I hear a... Yeah. Do you know what that's from? It's the lights. Okay. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't me. Okay. Let me share with you, if I could, just for a couple minutes, the very first few pages of this book from the opening chapter, which is called If You See Something, Say Something. This is a book about America that begins in China. In September 2010, I attended the World Economic Forum Summer Conference in Tianjin, China. 5 years earlier, getting to Tianjin had involved a 3.5-hour car ride from Beijing to a polluted, crowded Chinese version of Detroit. But things had changed. Now to get to Tianjin, you head to the Beijing South Railway Station, an ultra-modern flying saucer of a building with glass walls and an oval roof covered with 3,246 solar panels. You buy a ticket from an electronic kiosk offering choices in Chinese and English, and you board a world-class high-speed train that goes right to another roomy modern train station in downtown Tianjin. Said to be the fastest in the world when it began operating in 2008, the Chinese bullet train covers 72 miles in 29 minutes. The conference itself took place in the Tianjin Beijing Convention Center, a massive, beautifully appointed structure, the like of which exists in few American cities. As if the convention center wasn't impressive enough, the conference's co-sponsors in Tianjin gave some helpful facts and figures. They said that this convention center had a total floor area of 2.5 million square feet. and that construction of the Beijing Convention Center started on September 15th, 2009, and was completed in May 2010. Reading those lines, I started walking around my hotel room, counting on my fingers, September, October, November, December, January. That's 8.5 months. Returning home to Maryland from that trip, I was describing the Tianjin complex and how quickly it was built to my co-author, Michael, and his wife, Anne. At one point, Anne interrupted, "Excuse me, Tom, have you been to our subway stop lately?" We both live, as I said, in Bethesda, Maryland, and often use the Washington Metro Rail to get to downtown D.C. I had just been at the Bethesda station and knew exactly what Anne was talking about. The 2 escalators there had been under repair for nearly 6 months. While the one was being fixed, the other was closed. At rush hour, this was creating a huge mess. Everyone trying to get on and off the platform had to squeeze single file up one down lockdown escalator. It sometimes took 10 minutes to get out of the station. A sign on the closed escalator said that its repairs were part of a massive escalator modernization project. What was taking this modernization project so long? We investigated. A spokeswoman for Washington Metro said the repairs were scheduled to take about 6 months and are on schedule. Mechanics need 10 to 12 weeks, she said, to fix each escalator. A simple comparison made a startling point. China's Teta Construction Group took 32 weeks to build a world-class convention center from the ground up, including 2 giant escalators in every corner, and it was taking the Washington Metro crew 24 weeks to repair 2 tiny escalators of 21 steps each. We searched a little further and found that on November 14th, 2010, the Washington Post ran a letter to the editor from Mark Thompson of Kensington, Maryland, who wrote, "As someone who has ridden Metro for more than 30 years, I can think of an easier way to assess the health of the escalators. For decades, they ran silently and efficiently. But over the past several years, when the escalators are running, aging or ill-fitting parts have generated horrific noises that sound to me like a Tyrannosaurus Rex trapped in a tar pit, screeching its dying screams." The quote we found most disturbing, though, came from Maryland Community News. It was from a regular Metro rider, Benjamin Ross, who said, "My impression standing on line there is that people have sort of gotten used to it." People have sort of gotten used to it. Indeed, that sense of resignation, that sense that, well, this is just how things are in America today, that sense that America's best days are behind it and China's best days are ahead of it, has become the subject and subtext of water cooler, dinner party, grocery line, and classroom conversations all across our country. So do we buy the idea, increasingly popular in some circles, that Britain owned the 19th century, America dominated the 20th, and China will inevitably reign supreme in the 21st? No, we do not. And we have written this book to explain why no American, young or old, should resign himself or herself to that view. The two of us are not pessimists. We are optimists, but we are frustrated. We are 2 frustrated optimists. The title of this opening chapter, "If You See Something, Say Something," well, you know where that's from. It's the mantra of the Department of Homeland Security. It plays over and over on loudspeakers in bus stations and train stations in all of your cities. Well, we have seen and heard something, and millions of Americans have too. What we've seen is hiding in plain sight. We've seen something that poses a greater threat to our national security and well-being than anything al-Qaeda does. We've seen a country with enormous potential falling into the worst sort of decline, a slow decline, just slow enough for us to not drop everything and pull together as a country and fix what needs fixing. This book is our way of saying something about what is wrong, why things have gone wrong, and what we can and must do to make them right. That's how the book opens. Now, the main argument of this book is that our country today faces really 4 great challenges. I can only talk about one in detail, but let me go through them quickly. The first is a perceptual challenge. How we start our day in America. Because if there's one thing I've learned traveling around the world, it is that successful companies, successful cities, and successful countries start their day every day with a very simple question: what world am I living in? What world am I living in? What are the biggest trends in this world? What are the policies I need to put in place to take advantage of those trends and to nurture all the potential from them? That is not how we start our day in this country. We start our day in this country with our two biggest parties taking out a large crowbar and asking how they can stick it in the wheel of the other party in order to win the 24-hour news cycle. As part of doing the research for this book, I visited Singapore. And there's something a Singaporean economist said to me that really stuck in my mind. He said, Tom, we in Singapore live in a thatched hut with no doors and no windows. We feel every change in the direction of the wind. We feel every change in temperature. You Americans are living in a brick house with central heating. You seem to feel nothing. But that house is developing some cracks. And that leads to the other three challenges we face. The first, and I believe most important challenge we face, is adapting our country and workforce and children and cities to the biggest thing happening in the world today, the thing we should be talking about most, the merger of globalization and the IT revolution, which is changing everything. I will talk about that in detail because it's a huge workforce and education challenge. The other two challenges we face you're very familiar with. They are debt and deficit and all that nexus of issues of entitlements and how we manage them for the next generation. And the fourth challenge we face is energy and climate, how we power the future of an American middle class and rising global middle classes without tipping this world into disruptive climate change. So those are the four big challenges: how we look at the world, the merger of globalization and IT, how we manage debt and deficit, and how we manage our energy needs in a world of rising middle classes. Let's go back to the merger of globalization and IT, which I believe is the biggest thing happening in the world today. If we weren't in a subprime crisis or post-subprime crisis, if we weren't in a post-9/11 era, it's all we would be talking about. Essentially, what has happened is that in the last decade, we have gone from a connected world to a hyper-connected world. And this move from connected to hyper-connected is really changing everything. Now, the simplest way I can explain it to you is the mayor said in 2004, I started working on a book called The World is Flat. It came out in 2005. That was about the world getting connected. When I sat down with Michael to write this book, one of the first things I did was go back to the first edition of The World is Flat. And I opened it up to the index, and I looked under FFFFA. Facebook wasn't in it. So when I was out there saying the world is flat, we're all connected, Facebook didn't exist, Twitter was still a sound, the cloud was still in the sky, 4G was a parking place, LinkedIn was a prison, applications were what you sent to college, and for most people, Skype was a typo. All of that... I love doing that. Can I do that again? All of that happened in the last 6 years. All of that happened after I said the world is flat. And that is what has taken us from connected to hyper-connected. Oh, when I wrote The World is Flat, I said, wow, we've connected Boston and Bangalore in India. Well, we've now connected Boston, Bangalore, and Surrey. You say, well, where's Surrey? Oh, Surrey is a town 90 miles to the interior from Bangalore with 90,000 people, which thanks to web-enabled smartphones is on that grid with your kids in mind. When I wrote The World is Flat, I said we've connected Detroit and Damascus. We've now connected Detroit, Damascus, and Dera. You say, where's Dera? Oh, Dera is the dusty Syrian border town on the Syrian-Jordanian border where the Syrian uprising began, which from Dera, they've been pumping out cell phone camera, text, and video, so much so that we have been able to watch the Syrian uprising live, even though Syria has banned every international news organization from its country, including Al Jazeera. That's what happens when you go from a connected to a hyper-connected world. Now, I love when I travel to, look for small items in the newspapers. They tell you often wonderful and revealing things. In October 2010, I was in India reading the Hindustan Times over breakfast. Ran into a small news item that really struck me. It said that a Nepali telecommunications firm had just started providing third-generation mobile network service, or 3G, at the summit of Mount Everest, the world's tallest mountain. The story said this would allow thousands of climbers and trekkers who throng the region every year access to high-speed internet and video calls using their mobile phones. Can you imagine how many phone calls are being made every day now from the top of Mount Everest that begin, "Mom, you'll never guess where I'm calling you from." Okay? That's from a connected to a hyper-connected world. But we see it in other ways as well. I believe a gentleman over here was the mayor of Davenport. I was at Davenport, Iowa, and my wife grew up in Marshalltown. Well, nearby Davenport in central Iowa is a wonderful town called Grinnell. My mother-in-law went to Grinnell College, a great liberal arts school, 1,600 students. She was later chairman of the board. Last year, Grinnell College reported that almost 9% of its applications came from China. Of that 9%, 43% had perfect 800s on their math SATs. That's going from a connected to a hyper-connected world. So the old days when, basically we had our little, nice Chinese exchange student Zhao at Grinnell. No. Your kids today who want to go to Grinnell are competing head to head now with students from PS21 in Shanghai. That's the difference of a connected to a hyper-connected world. Now, what does all this basically mean? Well, let's look at what it means, first of all, for the workforce, and then what it means for education. What it means for the workforce is basically this. If the whole world were a single math class, in a hyper-connected world, the whole global curve, remember you were graded on a curve? The whole global curve has risen. Because basically every employer now has access to more cheap automation, cheap software, cheap robotics, cheap labor, and most importantly, cheap genius than ever before. Wonderful article in The Atlantic this month about the impact of this on the workforce. There's a little quote in that article that really struck me. It was someone talking about an automated cotton processing plant today. He said this plant just has 2 employees, a man and a dog. The man's there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to keep the man away from the machines. Okay? That's basically what's going on today in more and more factories in a hyper-connected world. Now, what does this mean for the workforce? Well, historically, our workforce was segmented into 3 categories. There was what was called non-routine work. Oh, we all want to be non-routine. That's writers and singers and poets and engineers and scientists and professors. Okay, that's people who do work that cannot be described by an algorithm and therefore cannot be outsourced, automated, or digitized very easily, if at all. You all want your kids to be doing non-routine work. Then there's routine work. Routine work has been crushed. That's all that backroom work that is now being outsourced, automated, and digitized. Finally, there's non-routine local work. That's the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the nurse, the person who has to do their work face-to-face in a specific locale. Their wages will depend on the overall health of your city and local economy. But the biggest thing that's happened as we move from connected to hyper-connected is what's happened to non-routine work. Now, non-routine work, the way we train people for that, you'll hear a lot of this in the educational reform movement, is we want people who can do critical thinking and problem solving. That's the essence of non-routine work, something a machine or robot cannot do. But basically what's happened very subtly as we've moved from a connected to a hyper-connected world is it's not enough anymore to do non-routine work. You now have to do creative non-routine work. You cannot just show up. So we have a chapter in the book that tries to explain this. The chapter is called Help Wanted. What we did was we interviewed 4 generic employers in the hyper-connected world. One high-end white-collar, the head of a national law firm, Nixon Peabody. We interviewed the head of their Washington office, Jeff Less. We interviewed a low-end white-collar, the head of the outsourcing firm, actually where I started, The World is Flat. We interviewed a blue-collar firm, Ellen Kullman, the head of DuPont. And we interviewed the world's biggest green-collar firm, the United States Army, and the chief of its education corps. Now, here's what's really interesting. They're all looking for the same employee. They're all looking for an employee who can do critical thinking and problem solving in order to get an interview. Oh yeah, critical thinking and problem solving now, that's table stakes. That's considered just, routine. What every employer is really looking for now is someone who can not only do their job, but invent and reinvent their job as they're doing it. Because the pace of change is so quick now that the big boss up there, he or she cannot possibly know what's going on basically on the shop floor and the interface between the technology and the customer. If you don't have employees who can not only do their job, but invent and reinvent their job as they're doing it, you're going to have a real problem. There are game companies like Zynga. You might have read about them, big, hot, game company out of Silicon Valley. Zynga now does quarterly reviews of their employees, their team leaders. Very simple. They may be doing in a year 5 product cycles. They cannot wait till the end of the year to find out they have a bad team leader. They're going to miss 4 product cycles with that bad team leader. They're now doing team leader reviews every quarter. They're at the cutting edge of something, though, that is not going away. So let's go to Jeff Lesk. He's the head of the Nixon Peabody Washington office. Jeff happens to be a family friend. We started this conversation in 2007. That's when I first started thinking about this. Lehman Brothers has just melted down. We're in the heart of the subprime crisis. I say, Jeff, what's happening at your law firm? He said, we're business way off. What's going on? What are you doing? We're laying off lawyers. I said, that's interesting. In a law firm, who gets laid off first? Is it last in, first out? He said, not anymore. We can't afford that. What's happened in our law firm, he said, is that when we had a lot of work during the credit bubble and we handed that non-routine work to our non-routine lawyers, and they did it in a routine, non-routine way and handed it back, everything was fine. Today, those who do it in a routine, non-routine way, they're the ones we're having to let go, some of them. No, the ones we're keeping, he said, are the lawyers who came to us and said, Jeff, we could do this old work in a new way. We could do this non-routine work in a truly non-routine way, or we could do totally new work in a new way. Read his interview in the book. It's very interesting. One of the first things he says when we sit down is, we just hired a chief innovation officer. Now, how many law firms do you know have a chief innovation officer? But in fact, every firm today, whether it's the New York Times, a law firm, or an accounting firm, is going to have a chief innovation officer to keep up with this pace of change. Really interesting for me was our interview with the head of that green-collar firm. He's General Martin Dempsey. You may have heard his name because he's since become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our senior military commander in this country. But we interviewed General Dempsey because at the time, he was head of the U.S. Army Education Corps. But what's really interesting about him is General Martin Dempsey was the commander of the 1st Armored Division that took Baghdad from Saddam Hussein in 2003. He was the commander who took Baghdad. And here's the story he told us in the book. In 2008, he was promoted to be head of CENTCOM, America's Middle East Military Command. In that post, he went out to Afghanistan and visited a far-flung base near the Hindu Kush that was commanded by a U.S. Army captain. He spent a couple hours sitting with that captain, hearing about his job. And he realized after a couple hours with that captain had access to more firepower and could access more tactical and national intelligence than he, General Martin Dempsey, could when he took Baghdad from Saddam Hussein 5 years earlier. That's how much had changed in the move from a connected to a hyper-connected world. So one of the first things he did when he took over the Army Education Corps was begin to revamp completely Army education, because how we choose that captain, and how we promote that captain, and how we train that captain has to become fundamentally different. One of the first things he introduces at boot camp now, one of the first things they might do is give you an iPhone the day you show up at boot camp. And after 3 weeks, they may ask you to download the app while your drill instructor sits in the front row and has you teach the course. Because you better be creative non-routine, not just non-routine. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking very easy for you to say, Mr. New York Times columnist. No, let me tell you about my world. I inherited, as the mayor said, I became the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times in January 1995, just down the street here in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. I inherited James Reston's office when I took this job. What a thrill. One of the great columnists and editors of the New York Times in the 60s and 70s. Now, I suspect Mr. Reston used to come to the office back in the 60s and 70s and start his day by saying, I wonder what my 7 competitors are going to write today. And by the way, he knew all 7. Walter Lippmann, Mary McGrory, Stuart Alsop. I do the same thing. I come to the office every morning and I ask, I wonder what my 70 million competitors are going to write today. I have 70 million competitors. I was just in India a month ago, or about 6 weeks ago, did a story about a $35 iPad that the Indians have invented. By the way, we're going to see tons of this, radical price breaks in a hyper-connected world. It was a Sunday column, went up in the New York Times about 8 p.m. Sunday night. I don't know, about 11 p.m. Sunday night it must have been. Someone in India had posted a stress test of the entire iPad and all the results in the comments section of my column. So, the old days, I became a foreign correspondent for the New York Times in 1982. I was in Beirut. In those days, it took the New York Times 6 weeks, literally, to get to Beirut. I could write whatever I wanted about Arafat. Maybe someone in New York would call Arafat, on a long-distance, scratchy phone line, did you see what Friedman wrote about you? Who? Friedman. Freeman? No, Friedman. What did he write? And then the line would go dead. Now, you write about a $35 iPad in India, and somebody posts the stress test from India 4 hours later. So if you don't think that doesn't keep me on my toes, well, you're not paying attention. And that leads to the last chapter in this education section. It's called Average is Over. And friends, that is the world we live in now. Average is officially over. Because basically your boss now has access to so much more above average talent, software, automation, and robotics that everyone now needs to find their extra. What is that unique value contribution you can make? Because that is what every one of your bosses is going to be asking. What is your extra? Now, everyone's extra is different. Steve Jobs' extra was inventing the iPhone and the iPad. Maybe someone else's extra is that they work in a nursing home and they have that ability to put a smile on the face of your elderly parent. And every time you come to that nursing home, you say, oh, Sue over there, I want Sue to deal with my mom. How much more do I have to pay? Everybody, I believe, is above average at something. But everyone's got to find their extra. Because Woody Allen's dictum that 90% of life is just showing up is officially over. If you just show up now for your job, trust me, there is a machine, a robot, a cheap laborer, or a cheap genius, or a software system waiting to eat your job. The old saying in Texas that all you ever get is all you ever got. If all you ever get is all you ever got, if all you ever do is all you've ever done, all you'll ever get is all you ever got, is also NA, no longer applicable. If all you ever do is all you've ever done, all you'll ever get will not be all you'll ever get. You will get below average now. And there is nothing really down there anymore. I live in Bethesda, Maryland, down the road from Baltimore. 50 years ago, the biggest employer in Baltimore was Bethlehem Steel Company. You could get a job at Bethlehem Steel, drop out of high school, join the union, get a job, have a career, get a mortgage, buy a house, have a yard, 2 kids and a dog, retire with dignity and grace and live a great life and go to Orioles games on weekends. Today, the Bethlehem Steel is basically gone from Baltimore, and the biggest employer in Baltimore is Johns Hopkins University Medical Center. They do not let you cut the grass at Johns Hopkins without a BA. That shift, okay, is what's going on in every city in the country. So we have 2 educational challenges right now. We need to bring our bottom to our average so much faster. That's about the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Because if you do not have a high school degree that allows you access to post-secondary education without much remediation or any at all, there is basically nothing down there that will give you an average lifestyle. But at the same time, we need to raise our average to the global average so much faster. That's about the 3 C's: creativity, collaboration, and communication, and how we nurture those in our young people. So we have this simultaneous dual education challenge. How do we lean into this world? Well, I have two daughters in their mid-20s, and I can only tell you what I tell them. I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I'm so lucky. When I graduated college in 1978, when I graduated from graduate school, I got to find a job. What I tell my girls is, you will have to invent a job. It may not be your first job, but to keep that first job, you will have to invent and reinvent that job in this hyper-connected world. So how do you lean into this world? I have 3 pieces of parenting advice that we offer in the book. Excuse me one second. The first is, think like an immigrant. Okay. Second is, think like an artisan. And the third is, think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House in Minneapolis, my favorite restaurant. What do I mean, think like an immigrant? How does the immigrant think? The immigrant thinks, I just showed up here in Washington, D.C., and boy, there's no legacy place waiting for me at Georgetown or Howard University. I better figure out what's going on in this city, where the opportunities are, and pursue them with more energy, vigor, and consistency than anybody else. That's how the immigrant thinks. We are all, friends, immigrants, new immigrants, to the hyper-connected world. Think like an immigrant. Be hungry. Second, think like an artisan. This is an idea from Larry Katz, a Harvard great labor economist. Who is the artisan? The artisan was that person in the Middle Ages before mass manufacturing, before the factory, who made every item one-off. They made every purse individually, every pair of shoes individually, every utensil individually, every piece of furniture individually. And what did the best artisans do? They were so proud of their work, they carved their initials into it. They brought something extra. Do your job every day as if you'd be ready and desirous of carving your initials into it at the end of the day. Think like an artisan. Take pride in what you do. That will be your extra. And lastly, think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House. So I was working on this book, and I was home in Minneapolis, my hometown, having breakfast on a Sunday morning with my best friend Ken Greer at Perkins Pancake House on Highway 100. 7 a.m. I ordered 3 buttermilk pancakes and scrambled eggs. Ken ordered 3 buttermilk pancakes and fruit. And after 15 minutes, the waitress came back, put our 2 plates down, and all she said to Ken was, I gave you extra fruit. She got a 50% tip from us because that waitress didn't control much, but she controlled the fruit ladle. And that was her extra. She was doing what? She was thinking entrepreneurially. You want to lean into the hyper-connected world, think like an immigrant, be hungry, think like an artisan, take pride, and think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House. Always think entrepreneurially. Somewhere in all that, you'll find your extra, because average is officially over. We all now live in Garrison Keillor's fictional Lake Wobegon, where all the men are strong, all the women are beautiful, and all the children are above average. So that's basically the hyper-connected world and its implications for the job market and education. I'm not going to deal with debt and deficit and climate. Let's just talk for a few minutes before we go to Q&A. How did we get here? How did we get here to this situation? Well, I think we got here for 2 fundamental reasons. One is our political system is broken, and I don't think I have to tell the people in this hall that it's broken for a lot of reasons. It's broken because of the gerrymandering of political districts, thanks to Google Maps down to the atomic level. It's broken because of the way the media has been fragmented. And most of all, it's broken because money and politics are completely out of control. Our Congress, I am not at all reluctant to say, has become a forum for legalized bribery. That is exactly what it is, okay? And until we get over that, the political system is broken. One of my favorite quotes in this book is from Mike Murphy, the political consultant who worked with John McCain. Mike's a very wise political advisor. He's worked for Republican candidates over the years. He told an interesting story. He said when he was just getting started in politics, he had a friend in the ad business. And he went to him for advice on how to think actually about negative campaigning. And his friend told him this story. He said, Mike, you know, people often asked, why did Burger King never attack McDonald's? Why did Burger King never take out ads saying McDonald's hamburgers have maggots in them? Okay. He said, very simple answer. First rule of advertising, never kill the category. Never kill the category. Friends, we have killed the category of politics in this country just when we need it most. That's what's going on, and that's the first big problem. Second big problem is we have had a fundamental values decline in this country. We have gone from a greatest generation that believed in save and invest to a baby boomer generation. It's done a lot of good things, but unfortunately also believed in borrow and spend. We've gone from a generation that believed in sustainable values, values that sustain relationships, communities, families, businesses, where you were too sustainable to fail, to a generation that believed in situational values, do whatever the situation allows. If the situation allows me to give you a subprime mortgage and all you want is to buy an $800,000 house, you can only show $10,000 in income and the only ID you've got is your Delta Sky Miles card, no problem. If the situation allows me to do that, I will just do it. Sustainable values would tell me never to do that, but that is the huge values decline that we've come to. What do we do about it? I think the most important thing we need to understand, and this is why our book has a backward-looking title but a forward-looking theme, is that we have within our history and our laws and our society all the resources to make this right. We did not get here by accident. We did not become the world's richest country, most respected country, by accident. We got here because we actually had a formula for success, which we outline in our book. It's a very simple 5-part formula. It dates back to Hamilton and our first presidents and was nurtured and enriched by every president since. It has 5 key parts. 1, we always educated our people up to and beyond whatever the technology was. So when it was the cotton gin, we made sure everyone had universal primary education. And when it was the factory, we made sure everyone had universal secondary education. And now that it's the supercomputer, we need to make sure everyone has universal post-secondary education. We educated our people up to and beyond whatever the technology was so they could get the most out of it. Second, we had the world's most open immigration policy in the last half century, if not more, where we invited in the world's most energetic and the world's most talented immigrants, where they came here and started new companies and lit a fire, a constant fire under our society. Third, we had the world's best infrastructure, roads, airports, an interstate highway system that the whole world copied. Fourth, we had the best rules and regulations for capital formation to incentivize risk-taking and to prevent recklessness. And lastly, we had the most government-funded research to push out the boundaries of science and physics and chemistry and biology so our venture capitalists could come and pluck off the best flowers and make of them all these new companies. That was our 5-part formula for success. It was the essence of the world's greatest public-private partnership. Whenever I hear people stand up and say, I was just one lonely guy, I did all this on my own, I say, you didn't do diddly squat on your own, okay? What you did, you didn't build those roads, you didn't set up those courts, you didn't establish that rule of law, you didn't build this telecommunication system, you did nothing on your own. We did it thanks to a great public-private partnership where each one nurtured the other. Well, look where we are today. Thank you. Well, let's just do a little check on our formula for success today. Education, according to the PISA tests, our 15-year-olds in math and reading comprehension are now in the middle of the pack with Slovenia and Argentina, wonderful countries, but never really considered our peer competitors. Immigration, well, if you watch the Republican debates, it was who could put up more electric fences to keep more people out. That was the message. The message was go away. And by the way, if you happen to come here and get a degree, take your degree and get the hell out of here, okay? Go back and start a company that will compete with us and take more of our jobs, okay? That basically was the message, okay? Third, on infrastructure, well, Mayor, I hate to tell you this, but I flew from Hong Kong to LAX the other day, a few weeks ago. That's like flying from the Jetsons to the Flintstones, okay? Because, LAX looks like a faded movie star. It looks, that's had one too many facelifts. Not the mayor's problem, he's trying to fix it. But this is a problem we have all over our country now. Fourth, rules for capital formation and investing. How'd you like that subprime crisis? And lastly, government-funded research. Oh, you seen that graph? That looks like an EKG heading for a heart attack. So think about it, friends. We're not here by accident. All this happy talk about how we're exceptional, and Obama doesn't say we're exceptional enough. Exceptionalism is not like an honorary doctorate that you get to carry around all your life. No, American exceptionalism is like your batting average. You are your batting average. And right now we're batting about 216. Okay? That's the real truth. Because if you look at our 5-part formula for success, every one of them is heading down. What do we do about it? It seems to me very simple. We need a hybrid politics. Because we need to do 3 things at once right now, friends. We need to cut spending because we have made promises to the next generation we cannot possibly keep, particularly in healthcare. Second, we need to raise revenue because we cannot just cut and shred our social safety nets because there is no capitalism without safety nets. Believe me, capitalism is a brutal, tough system. I'm a capitalist. I'm a market guy. But one thing I understand is capitalism is about creative destruction. It leaves people behind. No safety nets, no sustainable capitalism. Lastly, we need to invest. We need to invest in our airports and our roads and all those elements of our formula for success. So our problem right now is very simple. Our problem right now is that we need to do 3 things that do not correspond to the stated agenda of either of our major parties. Because we need to cut, we need to tax, and we need to invest. We need a hybrid politics. And I'm still hoping that this election will not be an attempt for Republicans to demonize President Obama as a Kenyan socialist, for Democrats to demonize Mitt Romney as, the essence of, a rapacious capitalism, to see which one can win by 50.00001% with no mandate to do what we need to do. We need a president who wins this election, to me, with the following mandate. One is a plan, short-term plan, to invest in major infrastructure projects, and I'm not saying this just for your benefit, in every one of our cities, to upgrade our infrastructure and to invest in post-secondary education for more of our young people. We can borrow that money today at 2%. That's an investment which we need. We need to couple that, in my view, with the Simpson-Bowles plan or its equivalent for long-term spending cuts to get our fiscal house in order. And by the way, if you don't pair the two together, you're never going to get bipartisan support for either one. Third, we need a plan that's fair. Rich have to pay more. They've had a bountiful 2 decades, but everybody has to pay something. We're all in this together. And lastly, we need a plan that's aspirational. It's not just about balancing the budget. I didn't sign up for tax day. I signed up for the 4th of July. This is a 4th of July country. Come to people and tell them you have a great plan for short-term fixing our infrastructure, for long-term fixing our deficits, that's going to be fair and aspirational. And I tell you, that person is going to be the next president of the United States. I think the country is so far ahead of our politics now. And they're dying for someone to be bold in that way, radically responsible, radically visionary, and radically honest. If we have a campaign that's about smearing each other, I tell you, stash your money under the mattress. If we have a campaign of 2 competing visions of how we actually fix this country, put every dollar you have in the stock exchange, because it's going to go up by thousands of points. But that's what's in play right now, and that's certainly what I'm watching for. Let me end by simply saying this. I began by saying I'm a frustrated optimist. By now, you're entitled to ask, Mr. Friedman, we get the frustration. Where from comes the optimism? Drugs. I use a lot of drugs. No. Nope. Nobody tweet that, all right? That's a joke, all right? So, my optimism comes very simply from being a reporter and having traveled around this country to write several books now. And the one thing that always keeps me an optimist about America is that this country is still full of people, thank God, who just didn't get the word. They didn't get the word that we're down and out. They didn't get the word that we're in decline. They didn't get the word that China's need our breakfast. They didn't get the word that Germany's need our lunch. And they just go out and start stuff and fix stuff and repair stuff and collaborate stuff and invent stuff. Thank God. If you want to be an optimist about America, stand on your head. The country looks so much better from the bottom up than the top down. I started my book tour in Quinnipiac University up in Connecticut near New Haven. Sat down in the president's office. First talk I gave about the book. Said, what's new here at Quinnipiac University? He said, we just started a new medical school. He said, you just started a new medical school in the middle of a recession. Didn't you get the word? No, they didn't get the word. One of my favorite quotes in this book is from a Marine colonel from Iraq when we asked him, why did you guys surge in Iraq? He said, Mr. Friedman, we were just too dumb to quit. This country is still full of people too dumb to quit, thank God. You know, in my last book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, I got to travel all over the country, talk about energy and environment and energy innovation. I'd end every talk with people coming up to me and giving me their business cards of all their energy ideas. I mean, amazing stuff. Mr. Friedman, I've got a duck. It paddles a wheel, blows up a balloon, issues methane, turns a turbine. I heard the craziest stuff. And I'd go back to my room at the end of the day. I'd empty my pockets in my hotel room of business cards from all these innovators. Rock stars get room keys. I get business cards, but they're really exciting in their own way, I got to tell you. But what they tell you is the country is alive. Oh, it's so alive. Which is why I've always said if I could draw a picture of America today, it'd be a picture of the space shuttle taking off. You know, the space shuttle, all that incredible thrust coming from below. That's us. That's all those innovators, all those people too dumb to quit, all those people down there who didn't get the word. Unfortunately, though, our booster rocket, Washington, D.C., our 5-part formula is cracked and leaking energy. And the pilots in the cockpit are fighting over the flight plan. So right now, we can't achieve escape velocity. We can't get to where we need to go, even though there's all that thrust coming from below. And that's why we have to fix the booster rocket, and we need to get the pilots to stop fighting over the flight plan. It's not that complicated. And that's why, friends, thank you. That's why, friends, as I said, we have a lot we can learn from China, a lot we can learn from India, a lot we can learn from Brazil, but the theme of this book is not about any of those countries. The theme of this book is that everything I'm advocating, we've done before. Everything I'm talking about comes out of a formula for success that's 200 years old. The history books we need to read are our own. The country we need to rediscover is America. That used to be us, and it can be again. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Will you take a couple of questions?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You know, Tom, I read your columns religiously. I've read The World is Flat, and That Used to Be Us. I've seen you in an audience on a number of occasions now, quietly. You didn't know I was there. And I could tell you, every time I hear him, the wisdom that comes out of his mouth, the prescience about what America needs to do and how we need to do it is, I think, the affirmation of that was the standing ovation you just got. So I saw my mayors mesmerized by your comments. And let me just say something really quickly. And I hope that you'll get a copy of our Common Sense, we'll get you a copy of our Common Sense Jobs Agenda. But one of the things that mayors have been talking about last year when we put together our civility accord after the tragic shooting of Gabrielle Giffords, this organization has been calling on the Congress to reach across the aisle. Many of us, in fact, I spoke to that yesterday, have said that Simpson-Bowles is a template for what we need to do, that we need to make investment in infrastructure. And we put a plan together, not just to get behind the surface transportation bill, but America Fast Forward, which 120 mayors have signed on to, says, we'll put up our own local money. You incentivize localities to do that. Loan us some money. We'll pay you back. Yeah. It doesn't go against the deficit or the debt. We could create 1 million jobs just with America Fast Forward alone. Across the board, this organization, by acclamation, by the way, over the last 3 years has taken a position in support of comprehensive immigration reform. Well, there it is. We'll give it to him. Well, here, we'll show it to him. But by the way, this Common Sense Jobs Agenda, we went to Democratic and Republican think tanks. We didn't just, this is a bipartisan organization. We went to both think tanks and we said, what if people supported over the last 50 years have had bipartisan support? These were some of the initiatives that we were told would get bipartisan support, and virtually none of them have been approved by this Congress. So I want to thank you, and I'd like to open it up to you. We have about, how much? About 10 minutes, maybe 15? I think there can be a few questions here, and I'd like to ask the mayors, by the way. Stand up and give your name.
Thanks. Please. Thanks. Where are you from?
Mayor John Dickert from Racine, Wisconsin.
Great. Next door.
Yeah, we're not far away. Come on up, visit us sometime. We have great tasting water, which you're not drinking right now. I know. You made a comment, Tom, that I think is important, which is that you said, how do we get back? How do we get the politicians back? So I'm gonna ask you to do something. You obviously have been on Sunday morning TV shows. You are someone who's obviously well-read. Mm-hmm. And I will beg to argue that when I've seen you on Sunday morning TV shows, and they usually have Congress or the senators there, one of the most dynamic Sunday morning shows was when Mayor Nutter was on. And it was dynamic because while the congressmen and senators were going back with their ping pong balls, our mayor brought the issue back to logic, to reality, and to getting it done mentality. When Mayor Vito DeGrossa was on Sunday morning TV shows, it's going back to the heart of the issues. But the reality is they're on very little. Mm-hmm. So what we see every Sunday in the media is the ping pong back and forth between Congress, Senate, the Republicans, and Democrats. So I guess my question to you is, when do you get these guys back on the TV so we can start hearing the reality of what's going on every day, talk about the answers to the questions, because the fact is they have them. Mm-hmm. And that's what the country needs to hear, and that's how we start bringing it back.
Well, it's a very important question, and I'm afraid you'd need David Gregory, the host of NBC, to be here to answer it, because I'm just a columnist for the New York Times and don't have control of any Sunday morning shows. But your point, though, is a very important one. Those tend to become so scripted. You almost know what everyone's going to say. It is a ping pong game, and having mayors, talk about things like a common sense agenda, I think could be very valuable and important. Of course, I mean, the old story. TV looks for conflict. That's what drives viewership and whatnot. And there's no question about that. But if you make things interesting, I think you can keep viewers. And so I take your point and I'll pass it along. Thank you very much. Please. Yeah.
My name is Shelley Welsh. I'm the mayor of University City, Missouri, which is a St. Louis suburb. Mm-hmm. And in my previous life, I was in the media, including 10 years with ABC Network News here in Washington and elsewhere. But I'd like to ask your opinion of what responsibility the media has played in this changing world. We yesterday heard a very good report on citizen public opinion on a variety of issues, all of which is in the public domain, most of which has not really been focused upon by our national media and local media. And our media seems to allow candidates, particularly, to say whatever they want about anything as fact when the facts do not exist. And I think this happens locally and nationally. So what responsibility does the media play?
Certainly, good question. I always have to start by saying I'm not here to represent the media. I only represent myself, and I don't even represent the New York Times, but I represent my column in the New York Times. So, but I tell you what strikes me about the web, which is that a lie can move faster around the web than ever before. As Mark Twain was supposed to have said, faster twice around the world before you laced up your shoes. He wasn't talking about the web, talking about the telegraph. But here's what's changed, and I think you should look into this a little. The counter to the lie also actually moves faster. There's PolitiFact now. The Washington Post has a dedicated column by Glenn Reynolds that I look at it every day that checks facts after every debate. And I've even noticed Republican candidates in the debate quoting the fact checkers now against each other. And so I think you should give the media a little due there. I think sometimes we react understandably. Someone comes out and says something, and it goes all over the world, and don't see actually how good and how immediate now a lot of the counter is. And I think that's quite healthy. There's usually an asymmetry. The counter comes the next day, and that's a real problem. It's a real problem for you and for me, But that is, the web is extremely good at correcting things quickly as well as it is disseminating them. So thank you. Please, I'll go back around. Oh, I'm sorry, you go there and then let she had a mic and then we'll go over here. Thanks.
I have the mic.
Please.
I'm from Fremont, California. I'm a first-generation immigrant who moved to this country 15 years ago.
From?
Bangalore, India.
Great.
Yes. My name is Anu Natarajan. When I take my
You're the mayor of Fremont, if I can?
Yes, I'm the mayor of Fremont. When I take my 8-year-old back to Bangalore every year, I'm alarmed at how little she knows compared to an 8-year-old in Bangalore. And yet when I come back to my community at a very local level that all of the mayors here can relate to are these silos that are created between cities, between school districts, and the lack of communication. Besides the plan that Mayor Villaraigosa had to take over the school districts, what would you suggest in terms of us working together and creating an infrastructure not just for higher education, but for a basic fundamental education for our kids?
Wow, that's such a big question, but it's a very important one. One we think about a lot. My wife is chairman of the board of the Seed School Foundation, which runs a charter boarding school here in Washington, D.C., and my daughter did Teach for America in D.C. and is a teacher in the D.C. school system. So we talk about this a lot. I mean, I'm happy to brag on them, but I'm telling you that it is a subject near and dear to our heart. I'll tell you how we deal with it in the book. And it's how we look generally at all our problems today, which is that what ails America today, we think fundamentally, is that we've lost our ability to act collectively. And all the problems we face require collective action. We cannot face the education problem without a certain amount of collective action, the energy problem, or the, Lord knows, the debt and deficit problem. And the fundamental thing we've lost here is the ability to act collectively. So our view about education is very simple. We actually profiled the Colorado teacher reform bill, which we think was a really good bill that worked collaboratively with the teachers' union and won the approval of one of the teachers' unions, I think it was the FT, for their reform. And it's one that, certainly puts teachers under review, but does it in a fair way and a collaborative way. So there's no question a great teacher can make a huge difference in a young person's life. We know that. And a bad teacher over several years can make just a hugely destructive difference. And we need to address that full on. And Michelle Reed did a wonderful breakthrough job here in Washington, I think, pioneering that. But now I think people are finding all different kind of ways to go down that route, and I really hail that. But we think it takes more than that. We think it takes a village. That is, yes, we need better teachers, Secondly, we need better parents. Okay, we need parents who take an active interest every day. I did a column a couple months ago, you could look up. It was with the people who conduct the PISA exam, the global PISA exam for the OECD. And they did a study underneath the PISA exam, 5,000, I think it was maybe more than that, 15,000 kids. They actually went and interviewed their parents. And they found that parents who did as little as ask their son or daughter, what did you do in school today? Or as little as, what are you reading? What are you working on? Let alone, have you done your homework and staying on top of it? Those kids performed so much better 10 years later in the PISA exams. So first of all, we need better parents. I'm going to be honest with you, we need better mayors. Okay, we need mayors who travel around the world and look not to lower the mayors and governors, not to lower the education standards in their districts so more kids can falsely achieve certain levels, but actually raise them. We need mayors who go to Shanghai and Taipei and come back and say, do you understand that if your kid wants to get into Grinnell now, who they're competing with? They're not competing with the kids in Claremont, okay, or Sacramento. They're competing now with a global audience. So we need better leaders. We need better neighbors. We need neighbors who are ready to pay education taxes to support those local schools, whether they have kids in them or not, okay? Because without that, I don't have to tell you, you're going to pay the school or you're going to pay for the new prison. There's a very direct line, okay, between failure of local schools and predicting prison population. So we need better neighbors. We need better business leaders. Business leaders who also take an interest in upgrading the schools around them and don't just say, I can't get it here, I'll go to Bangalore. Okay? And lastly, we need better students. Okay, we talk in the book about a young woman profiled in the New York Times who sent 40,000 text messages a month and wondered why she was getting C's and B's. Well, if you're sending 40,000 text messages a month, if you're not coming to school ready to learn and understand just what a hyper-connected and hyper-competitive world you're in where average is over, then you're going to be roadkill. And there's just no two ways about it. So, I said when I wrote The World is Flat, when I grew up, my parents used to say to me, Tom, finish your dinner. People in China and India are starving. And I tell my girls, finish your homework because people in China and India are starving for your jobs, okay? And if your kids don't know that, they're going to find it. I thought one of the worst movies ever made was this movie, Race to Nowhere, about how our kids are too stressed out, and Johnny and Susie, need to be on Facebook, and they have wrestling practice, and then the play. And look, we want kids to have a rich and diverse experience. I don't want my kids to be stressed out. But I'll tell you what stress is. Stress is not understanding the thick foreign accent of your first boss. That will be stress. Okay? So we need to face up to it. That's why I really like the Tiger Mom. Don't know if you read about her, but there's only one thing we talk about her in the book, but I can tell you about the Tiger Mom. She ain't alone. There are millions and millions of Tiger Moms out there. So and I'm sure you're one of them. So it's so that's our view on education. Thank you.
We'll take two more questions.
Okay, great.
Mayor Polito and then Mayor Nutter.
Mayor Polito from City of Santa Ana in California. Mm-hmm. Earlier you talked about how sometimes being too dumb to quit can be a real asset. I believe we're all too dumb to quit as mayors. We're in touch with our communities, and our communities often don't get the memo. And as you go out there, you see people all the time that are up to great projects. They're up to making a difference. Two questions for you. One, in California, we've got this part of the old Highway 66, and there actually is a cafe called the Roadkill Cafe, and it's off the main highway now because you got Highway 40, and if we're not careful, we're going to be on the wrong highway ourselves, and that's part of what you're talking about. And part of that, and the other portion maybe you could allude to a little bit is, earlier you mentioned how if you kill the category, then you kill everything.
Yep.
I think we as mayors have not killed the category.
That's true, yeah.
And that's a big difference. Could we in any way do something in that area such that maybe others could begin to stop killing the category? Because that really, really undermines our efforts.
It was a really important question. I don't have a simple answer for it. We have a chapter in the book on this subject. I'll be really honest. It's called shock therapy. And we think the system needs a shock. And by the way, it's going to get a shock. It's going to come from the market, Mother Nature, or the middle. one of those places. But we're going to get a shock if we keep going along like this. And I hope it isn't from the market or Mother Nature, because that will be brutal and messy. I hope it's from the middle. And the chapter really is about a third party. I mean, I believe in incentives. Life is about incentives, really. Move the cheese, move the mouse. Don't move the cheese, the mouse doesn't move. And I don't know if we're going to see the emergence of a third party. There's a lot of talk around there about it. I go back and forth myself, whether I want it. But seems to me if someone ran tomorrow, a responsible person, on this kind of centrist, ticket that I've talked about, and showed that there are 40 to 50% of the country, that believe in that, that would be a huge piece of cheese that I think would have taken great note of by our politicians, Let's remember, Teddy Roosevelt did this in 1912, had a huge impact on progressive reform after him. George Wallace did it in 1968, had a huge, I would argue negative, but impact after him. And Ross Perot did it, of course, in 1992. Ross Perot made Bill Clinton a deficit reducer. And Ross was a little, down there at the end, the elevator wasn't going all the way to the top. So it's yet Ross Perot, let's remember, won 20% of the vote, almost. So it shows you how Americans are really hungry, I think. I just think if, President Obama, I say it because he's president, just said, I'm going to just shuck off all this, Axelrod go home, Pluff go home. I'm going to run a radically responsible, radically bold, radically visionary campaign. One thing Democrats will always tell you is that, well, the Republicans are just impossible. They're trying to stop everything. And, I'm not going to get into that, whether it's, true or not in the Congress. I think there's a lot of truth to it, but we can debate all that later. But my point, my frustration is that all may be true in Congress, but I feel the administration, the president's never actually gone to the people. Actually just said, okay, these guys are blocking me. I'm going to not go to my base. I'm actually go to the people, okay, with a real plan. And I'm going to keep going to them. I'm actually call up Simpson and Bowles or whoever, and the Republicans who voted for that. And I'm saying, boys and girls, we're going to go on a road show. We're going to go all across this country. And we're going to tell every American why we need a grand bargain, why it's good for us, what it will contain, why it's hard, why it's the solution. If he did that for a month, I kind of think the Congress would get the message, And so that's my frustration. I know there's gridlock here. But what do? Do we just sit back and say it's gridlock and I'm going to shoot for 50.00001 by turning Bain Capital, into a four-letter word? Well, that's great. So somebody wins by 50.00001 and has no mandate. And so we're just back in the same soup. And if we're back in the same soup, it's we sometimes forget, we kind of toss this country around like it's a football. It's not a football. It's actually a Fabergé egg. You can drop it. You can break it. And I really don't want to be the generation that is known for not having had the responsibility to pass on the American dream to the next generation. But that's right where we're headed. So we got time for one more? Yes, yeah.
Finally.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk recently, some of the major companies who made significant gains and have increased their bottom line by outsourcing a lot of their work.
Yeah.
Recently, a number of companies announced that they're bringing some of that work back. President Obama announced certain incentives to create more of an insourcing environment. What's your view on that, and how can that be successful?
I haven't done any sort of full-blown study of it, but I hear it's going on. I still think there's a lot of outsourcing. I think the thing you have to understand, and if I were to do an update on The World is Flat, I think this is what it would be about. That as we go from a connected to a hyper-connected world, outsourcing is over. There's no more out and there's no more in. Okay? Basically, we're entering an age where the little sticker on your computer should say, made in the world. Okay? Because more and more things are not going to be made in America, not going to be made in China, or made in Taiwan. They're actually made in the world. And the whole idea of an export is really so 20th century. And if you look at all these products now, so how do we think about that made in the world? Well, certainly we want to be part of that supply chain where it's made. We want a share of that, hopefully the high-end manufacturing side of that. But I think that what we really want to aspire to as a country is not just made in America. That's part, we want part of that. I think what we want to aspire to is imagined in America. We want to be the place where things are imagined and orchestrated. You know, they've done a study of the iPod. These are, I don't have the figures exactly right, but they looked at if the iPod made $1, you know, basically at 10 cents went to China, and 90 cents went back to Cupertino, California, and the shareholders of Apple Computer. Because it's where products are imagined and where they are, where that global supply chain is orchestrated and how it's orchestrated, that's where the best jobs will be. And so I think we have to get out of the whole outsourcing thing, because if you actually talk to global manufacturers, they live in a world now where they will go wherever the talent is, and they can go. So you do not want to be Kurt Carlson of SRI, Stanford Research Institute. By the way, you have Siri on your iPhone. You know, Siri actually comes from SRI. They invented it. That's why it's called Siri. So Kurt has a saying. He said, you don't want to be best in class. When I have a project, if Apple comes to me and says, "Geez, we'd like a phone that talks back to you," I don't say, "Give me the best in my company to do this." I also say, "Don't give me best in class," because who wants to be in the same class with people? I want best in the world. And so what Kurt Carlson does when he gets a project, he literally goes and says, "Who is the best in the world now?" I see that in my business. I go to Real Clear Politics now when I want to read about the world. I can now read the best columns in the world. So things are going to be made in the world. I think the whole idea, we talked about this in the book, of developed and developing countries, again, that's very 20th century. I think we're going into a world of, I would call, HIEs and LIEs. High imagination enabling countries and low imagination enabling countries. Now, we are the highest imagination enabling country in the world. And we want to stay that way, because it's where products are imagined and then orchestrated where the big projects are. And by the way, in Cupertino, when that's going on in Cupertino, no, not everyone works for Apple, but the caterers and the lawyers and the service people. You know, there's going to be a lot of jobs, many of them decent, good jobs, for everybody, you know, down the line, as long as we're at the cutting edge of that spear. So basically, you know, I see this in countries. They're high imagination, they're HIEs and LIEs. And what the high imagination countries understand is that basically the single most important comparative advantage you can have as a country now is the ability to do this: spark ideas. See, if I've got this now, I can actually go to Delta in Taiwan. They'll design this for me. Skip over to Alibaba in Hangzhou, and Alibaba will get me a cheap Chinese manufacturer for this. Jump over to Seattle, Amazon.com. Jeff Bezos will do my fulfillment and delivery. Go to freelancer.com. They'll get me someone to design my logo for $19.95, and Craigslist will give me my account. They're all commodities now, except this. And so what we want is a country full of people doing that, you know, basically. And the more people are doing that, the more we'll get part of the manufacturing, the more we'll get part of the orchestration. But the goal now has to be not just made in America. I don't want to throw that overboard. We want that. But our real aspiration has to be imagined in America. Thank you very much.
Tom, that was great. That was absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much. Can we take a picture?
Oh, up to you.
Yeah, we're going to
Thank you.
Pictures. Come on, you guys. So we can have these two. Yeah. Yeah, right.
Everybody in? Why don't you get on this side? Some of you get on this side.
Nutter, sir. Enter.
Does it make sense?
Absolutely.
Bring it back to Minnesota. Yeah.
Got it? Please,
That would be incredible.
And when you visit your mother,
I appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Let me give you my information.
A couple times I've heard that. Really appreciate that. Thank you.
I am now going to use your
Please.
as a gospel. It's a gospel.
Well, what I tell people about the Ladies Flat, I said, people think they're talking about the inner city kids. And they're talking about, my daughter went to Marlboro and December. They're talking about kids in basketball. That's what we got to understand.
The big new book is that.
Mayor's house. Yes.
I'll let you know. Appreciate that. I got research. Really great idea.
I'll figure out a way to contact you.
I was going to say from New York Times Bureau. Because it's a really great idea. It's going to set the world on fire. Here, so throw that away. You can undo out of your pocket. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
The only thing is the gentleman, I had a question about similar to the gentleman who asked about the media and the press and their response. I asked you that question back. You gave a hilarious answer and dodged the question like a congressman. But it is in our society that we develop. They're the referee and the umpire. I understand because you can't represent or whatever. But I really believe, who else can change? Do politicians fighting in the cockpit? No, because if the press doesn't say, the one guy doesn't really know where he's going, and if he goes down a 180-degree turn, we're going to crash. And the more people know, that idea that you threw out, I love it. I'm so complimentary. I gave the world is flat when I left the presidency, and all of his customers were leading the other countries. But there's only one place that's really the referee, and it's them. And they are like referees in big time wrestling right now. We're battling and they just turn their backs on the facts because which one is accurate? I'm going to use that. I want you to say.
This is a courtesy question. When I give my students, do I attribute you right up front that I'm stealing from you, or with each item?
Just pay full price.
With each item.
Yeah, because I'm going to do the too.
There's